The letter of James, 108 verses, 60 imperatives. 60 times in 108 verses, we hear demands on our behavior. There are no soft, would you consider kind of statements in James. 60 demands. That is a demand, at least one demand for every 2 verses. I think James might best be heard read in a feminine voice. I'm thinking Siri, not Melissa. It was just, but demands every other verse. I mean, that's a lot. Last Sunday, we looked at themes of the book of James. We talked about the fact that it's not particularly rich in theology. It's a book of practical advice intended to instruct the Christian commitment. Dear Abby, day to day, the kind of everyday things that hamper or accelerate the Christian commitment. James is one of the general epistles of the New Testament. That is, it's not written to a particular person or a particular church. But don't mistake general for bland or ho-hum. Did I mention 60 imperatives in 108 verses? And these are pounding demands because the author knows that these day-to-day issues are where faith communities can get tangled up. The sins of the everyday are the things that can kind of move in and erode, and the writer is demanding a change in our behavior. And last week we looked at anger, one of those day-to-day things that can rip up a fellowship. And the misuse of anger is not considered by most of us one of the big sins. I mean, it's not one of the ones where people make signs and organize marches. Not one of the ones where folks gather up in little groups and decide whether or not those people can join the church or not. Since mishandling anger is our everyday sin, we don't go to Facebook very often and rail against it. You see, James is dealing with the everyday, day-to-day sins that sneak into a congregation and cause havoc. They don't look dangerous at first, bland enough, and then wham, and the damage is everywhere. And today, James takes on the sin of partiality. And how can partiality be a sin? Now this one's tricky because we show partiality every day. I have a partiality for Diet Coke over grape Fanta. I'm partial to college basketball over professional basketball. I have a partiality for Taqueria del Sol over Del Taco. How can partiality be a sin? Well, is it a sin when it involves people only? Well, soon we're going to gear up for a presidential election. And we're going to declare to each other that it is our duty to show partiality for one candidate over another and go vote. When is partiality a sin? I was showing partiality to Melissa when I asked her to marry me over against all the other women who wanted to marry me at the time. I'm being partial. I also have fits of delusion every now and then from the pulpit. But you understand what I'm saying? How can partiality be a sin? We show partiality all the time, every day. And then we read this. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has been accountable for it all. So we have a problem here. What are we to do? But in the scripture, there's a context. There is a story that's attached to this biblical declaration. And here's the story. Suppose a man comes into your meeting. He's well-dressed, gold ring on his finger. Another man, obviously poor, arrives, shabby clothes. You pay special attention to the well-dressed man, and you say, sit right here. Sit right here. Excellent seat. We want you here. And to the man poorly dressed, you say, probably back corner would be good, and we would prefer that you not sit, and if you do, how about taking a seat on the floor? Doesn't that prove you're showing partiality and setting yourself up to assess a man's quality? A very bad thing. And soon, partiality that looked safe enough at first has made its way in, and it's gross. You remember last week that the recipients of this letter are not really well-to-do. They're not the poorest of the poor, but they're not particularly well off. And so when the wealthy would come in, they would lean into, they were impressed by the people who were their oppressors. They were deferring, ignoring the poor ones. And the author of James is saying that the church's treatment of the poor is a test of a congregation's character. Now, according to scholar Haruku Ward, during the Reformation era, the church referred to the poor in two different categories. There were the worthy poor and the unworthy poor, which is kind of convenient. Late medieval Europe was a time of rapid urban expansion. Cities are growing because of war and famine and plague. People are trying to move into the cities to get access to jobs and medicine and food and the like. Only a few found a prosperous life, and many of them ended up as beggars. Well, before this, in the Middle Ages, Christians believed beggars played an important role in the part of salvation. The beggars were totally dependent on the mercy of God and the charity of Christians, and for them, the poor symbolized Christ the poor. And by assisting beggars, richer Christians were honoring Christ in the face of the poor. But then you had this increase now. They're everywhere. They're panhandlers every day on my way to work, and that led to a change in attitude. You see, the leaders of the Reformation taught an ethic of hard work, self-reliance, and a lot of these beggars they were encountering didn't learn any new skills. They just kept on begging. So they were considered, we're moving to two categories now, they were considered too lazy, and they were therefore unworthy of receiving charity. And soon the churches started only helping out the upper class who had lost their income and reduced to poverty and who were too ashamed to beg. And now people no longer saw the image of Christ in the poor beggars, but feared that they carried dangerous diseases and that they would contribute to moral decay. And soon they were banned altogether from the cities. The streets were cleaned up by shooing them along. This is the Protestant Reformation. And you guessed it, the Protestant Reformation gave birth to the Protestant work ethic. And both Martin Luther and John Calvin advanced the idea that it is the Christian's duty to work. And Calvin argues that even the rich should work. Everybody should work. Whether you need to work or not, whether you've got enough money or not, everybody should work. Work is noble. Everybody works. And the earliest American settlers brought this Protestant work ethic with them. And listen to this reflection by a University of Georgia historian. From their viewpoint, the moral life was one of hard work and determination. And they approached the task of building a new world in the wilderness as an opportunity to prove their own moral worth. What resulted was a land preoccupied with toil. When their friends and family started visiting the New World in the early 1800s, they were amazed. These people were so busy. They often complained about the lack of opportunities for amusement, and they were perplexed by the lack of a social strata dedicated to a life of leisure. Do you see how the Protestant work ethic just became a part of our fabric? We even established a holiday that celebrates labor. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Let's celebrate labor. Let's take the day off. Not surprisingly, 1757, Ben Franklin wrote in Poor Richard's Almanac, "God helps those who help themselves." Did you think that line was in the Bible? If so, you were with a lot of other people. Some of you thought that was in the Bible, did you? You remember when Jay Leno used to go around doing the jaywalking on the streets of Manhattan with a microphone, just asking random people questions? One night, he's out on one of these jaywalking things. People who walk by, he sticks a microphone in their face and says, "Name one of the 10 Commandments." And the most often repeated, God helps those who help themselves. Oh my gosh. But we've come to love that line. And so it may be true that the gifted and the strong have adopted the idea that there are two kinds of poor, the deserving and the undeserving. And if we think that way, we might show partiality. I heard of a church once that had in its benevolence policy that they wouldn't give out benevolence help to anyone who was requesting it because of addiction or bad decision making. Well, I don't guess they gave away much money, do you? The Protestant work ethic might have led us to categorize the poor. Poor Richard's Almanac, the American Heritage, might permit categories of deserving and undeserving poor, but the Bible has no such categories. The gospel condemns being partial to rich over poor, but it also condemns being partial to one group of poor over another. Everyone we meet, rich or poor, deserving or undeserving, is a child of God. Royalty, potential heir to the kingdom. As we heard earlier from the book of Proverbs, the rich and the poor have this in common: the Lord is maker of them all. And the author of James says, if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in this one point becomes accountable for all of it. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but you lack works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, be warm, eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. The poor are the poor. They are children of God. We are the Church of Jesus Christ, and it is part of our good mission to bring hope, relief, justice, and healing to all of God's creation, deserving and not. A group gathered years ago in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was kind of a rally, conference, discussion about the plight of the poor. Somebody modernized today's text, and they were handing it out at the conference, passing it to others who attended that day. And here's how they modernized today's scripture. I was hungry, and you formed a humanities club and discussed my hunger. I was imprisoned, and you crept off quietly to your chapel in the cellar and prayed for my release. I was naked, and in your mind you debated the morality of my appearance. I was sick, and you knelt and thanked God for your health. I was homeless, and you preached to me of the spiritual shelter of God's love. I was lonely, and you left me alone, saying you would think of me. You seem so holy, so close to God, but I'm still very hungry and lonely and cold. I know, and I agree. People should carry their own weight. People should work. People should not go around looking for handouts. And just like you, I have gotten practiced on talking about what other people should do. But the challenge of the gospel for us today is what we should do. And without partiality, we're to care for the hungry and the lonely and the cold, and it does not matter how they got there. Now, of all the people, TV's Stephen Colbert might be the best commentator on this passage that I read all week. Yeah, I'm digging through these volumes of theology, but the comedian who's the new host of The Late Show might be the best commentator I read all week on this text. As it turns out, he was doing one of his jabs on the Colbert Report a few years ago in response to another late-night political commentator type. The other political commentator had recently said on his show, while Jesus promoted charity at the highest level, he was not self-destructive. The Lord helps those who help themselves, does he not? Did you catch that? The other talk show host thought that was in the Bible. And here was Colbert's response in character. If this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we've got to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then admit we just don't want to do it. Now that's preaching. Do you want to be a part of a church that cares about this? That's organizing to go do this, to make real what it means to be the love of Christ in the world? If so, consider joining today. If you have not yet located your life with this family of faith to say, I want to make a difference in the world, today's the day. Come and be a part of feeding the poor and hungry, clothing the naked, making a difference in the world. Let's stand and sing and respond.